evening. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including Dakota seed land ceded and taken in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The History Department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So welcome to another meeting of the History Book Club, founded by my colleague and previous chair of the History Department, Ann Waltner, who has just started a term as interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts. So it's wonderful that she's able to still make time to join us here this evening for this interesting discussion. I'm Sarah Chambers, the current chair of the History Department, and Anne started this as a way to feature books of faculty and alumni of the History Department, to have interesting conversations about all the diverse work that people are doing. And we will start very shortly with a presentation by today's featured author, followed by a conversation, and then towards the end of the hour, you will be able to put your own questions into the chat, and I will read those for our guests this afternoon. And while normally it is Clayton Smith who is running the behind the scenes, what we are doing here at the book club on Zoom, he is on vacation, and so his colleague Alex Stern will be there in case any glitches come up, and none have in quite a while, so I'm not too worried about it, but he's gotten us set up and gotten things recorded. So I'm really thrilled to welcome alumnus Chi-Liang He, who got his PhD here in the department in 2006 and has written this very interesting book, Working the System, Motion Picture, Filmmakers, and Subjectivities in Mao-era China, 1949 to 1966. I learned a lot from this book because I knew almost nothing to start. I teach a course on using film in Latin America, but all the Chinese, especially Mao-era film, was new to me. And he will be, and it's, I think, a sort of relatively new area of research for Chi-Liang too, who's done really diverse work on all kinds of different topics related to modern China. And we're really happy to welcome as a conversation partner today, a colleague from another department, Asian and Middle Eastern languages and cultures. Jason McGraw is a specialist of Chinese literature and particularly Chinese film as well. So is very knowledgeable about this area that the book is addressing. So I want, without further ado, I will turn things over to Chi-Liang to give us a brief introduction to the book, and then they can launch into a conversation. Thank you.
Okay, it's my turn. First of all, I would like to thank Sarah, Jason, Alex, and Clayton for arranging this talk for me. And it's really exciting because I have a sense of going back home, actually. I graduated from the University of Minnesota 17 years ago. So it has been a long time, actually. For 17 years, I returned to Twin Cities only once, I guess. That's it. Okay, today I would like to give a brief talk about my newest book. Please allow me to share the screen first. Okay. So I suppose you can see, right? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see.
Okay,
Thank
very
you.
good. Okay, I would like to give an explanation about the title. It may not make very good sense in English, probably. So working the system. So where did I get the idea of working the system? Actually, I got the idea from a history book written by Stephen Kotkin, Magnetic Mountain. Okay, it was about Stalinism. It was about Soviet Union. So it was greatly written. It was highly helpful to my project in the very beginning. So basically, he said, but they also had to see that they could work the system to their minimal disadvantage. Okay, so basically, I borrow the idea of working the system clearly. So I followed Kotkin's idea and rewrite his phrase. So I basically said to rephrase Stephen Kotkin, those filmmakers under scrutiny in the present book not only worked under the system, so worked under the system, but formulated by the CCP. CCP means the Chinese Communist Party, but also worked the system, okay, to maximally benefit from it, or at the least to minimize the disadvantage brought about by the adverse working and the living conditions and the hostile political environments. So this was the reason why I would eventually like to name the book as Working the System, because I think the main topic of the book was not necessarily about film per se. The major topic of the book is about the self-realization of those filmmakers in a very critical time in Chinese history. Okay, they had to face something they had never imagined, probably. But they needed to work the system to benefit from the system, or to minimize the harm, basically. Okay. So this was my explanation about the title. So how could I do that? But before that, we needed to have some understanding about Mao era China. Some of you may be familiar with it, but some of you may not. So let me say a little bit about the so-called Mao era China between 1949 and 1966. So basically, it was a time when the government took full control over the film industry, essentially because the new government after 1949 actually had a delusion, I would say. The new government overemphasized the significance of film as a propaganda tool. So this was something we needed to understand. The second was the massification of the motion picture. Why did I say massification? Because it was the first time in decades that a film would eventually become a mass-produced and mass-consumed product because of the efforts made by the Chinese Communist Party. Peasants in the marginal remote areas would enjoy the opportunities to watch films, and this was unthinkable just a few decades ago. The third one was about the fates of those Chinese filmmakers. So we have learned a whole lot about how Chinese intellectuals, professionals were purged, were victimized because of the system. So yes, they underwent ups and downs during the Mao era China. There was no doubt about this. And the last one, I would question the so-called mode of resistance and accommodation. So previously, scholars would argue that intellectuals, artists, professionals in Mao era China either resisted the system or accommodated the system. But I would say, does that matter, really? I would say human nature is basically similar everywhere, East and West, Europe and Asia. human needs are basically similar. So actually, because of this, I borrowed the idea from I don't know how to pronounce the name of Georgie and Eniadi. So basically, the average citizen set his or her goals in basically the same way, whether living in Eastern or Western Europe. I browsed the archives. I did some research about those filmmakers, and eventually I got some very similar conclusion about that. The Chinese filmmakers, artists actually had very similar needs, just like their counterparts in other countries, not only socialist countries, but also capitalist countries. They needed to have their fame enhanced. They needed to get some pay raise. They needed to have their filmic products appreciated by the massive audiences. They wanted to be promoted. So they had the very similar needs, just like other people in the world. So this was the reason so sometimes I would say this was not a film history book. This was supposed to be a book about just everyday life. But what makes things different is the fact that these people were basically highly reputable artists. These people actually enjoyed a great fame, and they actually were the highest paid people in the People's Republic of China during the first 17 years. So they were a little bit different. So I have another project to take a look of the anonymous audiences. So in a sense, the protagonists in this book were basically elites in China, in Mao era China, but I still needed to have a separate project about the commoners, the viewers, the audiences. Okay, these were the details about Mao era China, about the fates of the film industry and the filmmakers. But finally, I need to have some explanation about how could these filmmakers, under very different political and cultural system, could benefit from the system and, as I have said, minimize the disadvantage. So I used 5 cases to elaborate on my points. So these were the 5 great filmmakers. Jason must be very familiar with them. The first one was Zheng Junli, okay, who began his filmmaking career back in the 1930s and 40s, and he became a very different person in the 1950s and the 60s because he made a lot of history films. So he succeeded in incorporating the Marxist historiography into his film or autobiographic movies. In a sense, he was not only the user of the Marxist historiography, he was the promoter, he was the initiator of this kind of new historiography in China. In case you don't know that, we need to understand. A massive campaign against a specific film back in 1950 would have become the trigger of refashioning the historical studies in China. So history and the film in Mao era China were inseparable because of that. So Zheng Junli established himself as a towering figure in both film and history in a sense. Okay. The second case was about Zhao Dan, who was a superstar, who had been a superstar before 1949, and he further established his status as a star. Not only because of his great performance, but also because of his political capital after 1949. He had all the connections with the higher authorities in Beijing. So he was successful for both artistic and political reasons. The third one was Sun Yu. Okay, so he tried the very best to save his career because in the first several years he had zero chance to make film. He belonged to the older generation directors, and he didn't really earn trust from the Communist Party in the beginning. So finally, because of the change of political climate in the late 1950s, he made the color film. You can see from the left. Okay, he made his only color film in his career, in his long career. Not very successfully, but he tried very hard to revive his career by incorporating his skills, techniques he used back in the 1930s to promote socialism. So he used the women as a metaphor, the metaphor of the Chinese nation, of course, and the Chinese modernization. But his techniques were criticized later. The two images you can see from this page were basically for, the screenshots from two films he made. The upper one was from a 1930s film. The lower one was from the 1950s film. You can see the similarities. Both films actually center on the women, and both films actually tried to show the healthy bodies of women as the metaphor of a strong Chinese nation. And you don't see a lot of films where women wear like swimsuits in Mao era China. You don't see many. This might be one of the only ones. He was bold back in the 1950s, but he was blamed for that later. So his practice, I will finally explain subjectivizing practice. Okay, so his way of reviving his career, his way of benefiting from the new system actually was not that successful. Oh, sorry, the typo. Okay, the next one, Wu Yonggang was also an older generation director. He gained his fame back in the 1930s because of his very first film. But once again, he didn't win the confidence from the Communist Party, so he was marginalized. He was politically marginalized, and he was purged even. He was branded as the rightist. So he was stripped of the opportunity to make film for over a decade. So eventually in the 1960s, he was allowed to make films, but only the opera films. So basically the films based on the traditional Chinese opera, like the Beijing opera. But he was highly successful not in China, but in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. So he found a new locus to not only make some films, but also to express himself. So he felt that he was wrong. He still wanted to win the confidence from the authorities, but he couldn't domestically in China. So he used those films based on the traditional Chinese opera to express his true feelings. So those films were designated to be screened only in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, but not domestically in China. So censorship was not that rigorous as a result. So he was able to express his feelings fully as a result. And this had a lot to do with the environment internationally. So we call it a cinematic Cold War. Hong Kong was a city of Cold War, And in the Hong Kong market, the right wing and the left wing filmmakers competed with each other. So this was not just about market competition. This was about the struggle between the pro-American, pro-British artists and the pro-Chinese artists. So he was able to make full use of this kind of environment to make films and express himself. The last one was a very interesting figure who would eventually become one of the best filmmakers in the history of China, I would say. Xie Jing, okay, he was a relatively young director at that time. He made a bunch of very important films. He made use of the system because the CCP authorities preferred the younger generation. They didn't trust the older generation directors. So Xie Jing, the last one, actually get a whole lot of opportunities from the 50s to the 60s and eventually to the 1980s and the 90s. But he made a lot of so-called political melodrama. So we understand the melodrama were basically intended to maximize human feelings and emotions, but his films rechanneled the human emotions to the political cause of the Communist Party. So basically, the critics would say, yes, this was the Xie Jing style or Xie Jing mode of filmmaking. But I would say, in my book, I would say this was not his own style. This was a result of co-authorship. Between whom? Between Xie Jing, the director, and the CCP authorities, because the higher authorities believed that it was inappropriate for the films to express, to display the private feelings. So private feelings were downplayed, and all the feelings, all the emotions would have to be transmutated into the passion for public cause, namely revolution. Okay. So the Xie Jing style was not his own style, but a style of co-authorship. Okay, so finally, I would like to explain what the subjectivizing practice is. So basically, my assumption was the artists didn't have a fixed, unchanged subjectivities before and after 1949. They needed to rebuild their subjectivities based on the new political and cultural system. So they used the filmmaking activities as a means of rebuild their subjectivities. So these actions, these practices, what we call the subjectivizing practices, they reshaped, they built their own subjectivities in accordance with the new environment. So that's basically my explanation of the whole book. Sorry, I have only like just a few minutes to do so. So I leave out a whole lot of details, of course, but thank you.
Thank you, Professor He. I guess, should I go ahead and start the discussion? I wanted to first just emphasize how I think this book represents the best of a relatively recent turn in Chinese film studies and Chinese cultural studies, which to me in the last 10 or 15 years has really started to look at Mao era culture in a much more nuanced and complex way than had ever been done before. I think, you know, it's basically we're still getting over quite a heavy Cold War hangover, which for decades meant that culture of the Mao era was basically quickly dismissed as propaganda and then not investigated any further. And a few scholars recently, I think, have paved the way in getting beyond that and getting beyond our sort of Cold War blinders. And this book is one of the best examples of that I've seen in literature on Chinese film history. And I also want to emphasize, I think this is an ongoing problem, not just in scholarship, but in our public discourse in general. If you read news coverage of China, you see them routinely revert to what Professor He calls the accommodation/resistance paradigm, meaning all culture and art produced in China is judged from the perspective of the West as just along the continuum of, is the artist heroically resisting authority, or is the artist cravenly submitting to authority? And the assumption is they have to do one or the other. I see this, for example, in the case of Mo Yan, the great Chinese fiction author. When he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, there was a huge debate that erupted in the West because people thought that he was too compromised, when basically all he did is work the system in a way that led to him having the career he had under the conditions he was working in. And the irony to me, when I teach this to students, I always try to get to this central irony that if you are coming from the perspective of the Western sort of Cold War mentality, ostensibly you think the problem under communism is that art and culture should not be subjected to politics. Art and culture should be autonomous. They shouldn't be intrinsically political. And yet, if you insist on judging an artist like Mo Yan by his politics rather than by his actual literature, then you're in fact doing what you claim not to like. You're judging art by political criteria only, or making that primary, which means you're basically doing what you claim not to think is right. So this is something we have to think about. And I think in our teaching and writing, it's important to do this for our students, to sort of model a way of taking cultures like this much more seriously and not othering them automatically. Having said that, I think maybe I'll start out my question with the asking maybe a comparative question, and maybe asking Professor He if he would provide a little more detail in terms of comparison. For example, I was actually going to ask you about Hollywood and whether working the system is really something that filmmakers everywhere do, given that the art form is inherently quite collaborative and requires a lot of social resources to do. So, for example, do filmmakers in China and Hollywood at this time, I'm thinking, 1950s, 60s, do they basically share the condition of working the system, or would you find some difference in what is necessary or what's unique to each system and in how to work the system? For example, is it as simple as politics being determinate in the Chinese system and the profit motive being determinate in Hollywood, and that's the system that has to be worked? But given your introduction, I want to expand the question also, since you mentioned that a study of Stalinism was one of your inspirations. I was wondering if you see any major differences in how working the system in China during the 17 years compared to the same in the Soviet Union, either under Stalin or after his death in the 1950s. So take that in any direction you want to.
Thank you, Jason. Actually, I would say, before I answer your questions, I would appreciate your influence on me, of course, because when you came to Minnesota, it was my last year in Minnesota as a PhD student, and you opened the door for me. Actually, I liked films a lot, but I was not able to do some film studies before that, and you recommended some readings to me, and we even translated an article together, right? So yeah, you had some influence on me, and finally, after 1 decade, I began to work on film history projects, right? Okay, so I appreciate that. And the second, I needed to answer your. Speaking of Mo Yan, I would give you a footnote. Okay, Mo Yan is being criticized in China because people consider him to be a person catering to the tastes of the Westerners. Okay, in a very interesting way. But when I was young, when I was a junior high student, Mo Yan's novels were kind of promoted by some book vendors as pornographic novels, by the way. So in case you don't know that. All right, then let me answer your questions. Yeah, interesting. I would say yes, filmmakers in different parts of the world, in one way or another, work the system. Yes. During Mao era China, basically it was the Cold War time, right? Yeah, the system of course was different. But in China, the country was highly politicized. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party was the authorities that took full control of film, and the Communist Party definitely censored the film from the very early stage all the way to the final stage, the screening. But I would say, even under this climate, you can not just use politicization to explain the filmmaking and the film production and the film distribution as politicization. Okay, you need to understand that the audiences still have their own choices, and the authorities still cared about the box office sales. I would like to start a project about that later. So we may want to in an over simplified way to describe the system in China as a highly politicized system, but the market force still mattered. And my first book about storytelling in China actually argued in a very similar way. Okay, in the United States, I would say, yes, markets actually matter the most, but political pressure, ideological consensus was also a part of the life for filmmakers. So you can make a comparison in such a way. And speaking of Stalinism, yeah, I was always thinking about, of course, the Communist Party in China learned a whole lot from the Stalinistic system in the Soviet Union, and the control and the use of film was one of them. So the reason why the Chinese Communist Party overemphasized the significance of film was basically because of the Soviet influence. There was no doubt about this. But we also need to understand that the Soviet Union was the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, and the Soviet Union began to come into being in the early 1920s. It was also the early stage of film. So in a sense, the Soviet Union, the communist regime in Russia, co-developed with the development of film. So the Soviet Union government had a tough time. I shouldn't say tough time. The Soviet Union government needed to learn how to deal with films. And so this was the reason why some like modernist artists, modernist filmmakers were able to contribute to the modernization in Soviet Union. And they were active contributors. But in China, the government had already learned how to cope with the film even before the regime was established in 1949. So I think this was the biggest difference.
Thank you.
And let me say one more thing. Another important thing about the film in China was the fact that the Chinese film industry was quite sophisticated even long before the establishment of the communist regime in China. So you can see the difference. In Russia, the film industry developed at the same time when the regime stabilized, but in China, the industry, the filmmaking industry had already been there. So this was so somehow a lot of artists felt that they were wronged. They were wrongly treated because they felt that actually they were highly successful with or without the Communist Party, which in my view was a delusion. Okay, thank you.
I also wanted to ask about, and this could lead to a much longer conversation, so I know you won't be able to engage it in depth, but the word subjectivities in your title, it strikes me that one of the fundamental things to the way you want to change the conversation in terms of the accommodation resistance paradigm is that while your work it's a work of history, of film history, not of philosophy or psychology, but it seems like part of your argument is implicitly a rejection of certain Western liberal humanists' ideas of subjectivity itself. The idea of subjectivity as a fundamentally autonomous phenomenon, and instead to view subjectivity as something that's always emerging within a social context. So that in some ways, you know, that helps to undermine that whole paradigm, because you can only have the ideal of the dissident artist if you have this idea of a subjectivity that can be completely context free and then face a political force. But in your framing, it's always already social. It's always already engaged in dialogue with other people, with institutions, and so on. Does that sound about right?
Yes, I agree with you actually. My point was the subjectivity was not something being. It was not something already being existing. It was something becoming. So this basically was my fundamental idea. It's just like those filmmakers actually didn't realize that they were reshaped by the new political and cultural environment. In most cases, they themselves didn't realize that. They believed that they were the artists, they were the famous directors before 1949, but they changed a whole lot. And the Chinese film market changed fundamentally. So sometimes people would say, yeah, they were famous, they were successful because of themselves, because of their talents, because of their own backgrounds. But so my point was they needed to take a step back and to re-examine the way in which they were able to achieve success. And I would say in the case of filmmaking in China, it was the Communist Party who expanded the film market significantly over just 1 decade, as I have indicated in the book. The population of film audience rose by 100 times, 100 times in 1 decade. So previously, those filmmakers were famous only in some major cities in China before 1949, and after that, they became the household names in the countryside, in the cities, and even in other countries. And they never realized that they gained a high reputation because of the system, not despite the system. So this was my point.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to be mindful of time and give other people a chance to ask questions. So maybe I will try to kick off the Q&A part with a more personal question for you. You have published an astounding 5 books in the 17 years since you finished your PhD at the University of Minnesota. So I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to early career scholars about getting monographs published in a timely fashion without sacrificing quality? And just open-ended question, do you have any tips on like working with publishers, surviving the peer review process, and so on? And maybe what's your secret to being so incredibly productive?
Well, it's a tough question for me, actually. It's even harder for me to give advice than to start a new project, in a sense, because I don't know. I would say I was always mindful of the significance of my project. So yeah, scholars like their own projects. There is no doubt about this. But I would say the first things first is to think very, very hard about the connectedness between your own scholarship and the others. I would say this has to be a recipe for success. And so when I think I have lost the contact with Professor Larry May, right? Larry May, when I took his seminar, because he had no idea about Chinese history. He always told me the significance. He didn't know anything about Chinese history, so he needed me to think about the significance to somebody who is not familiar with your own scholarship. So I would say I'm always reminded of giving the significance to the readers who has no background. Okay, the second one is your personal preferences, because everything I write about at this point is within my my own interest. I like film. Yes, ever since I was a teenager, yes, I watched a lot of films. I liked the performing arts in China when I was very young. Actually, my parents brought me to the theaters from time to time when I was a young boy. I liked journalism because my father worked as an editor of a magazine in China back in the 1990s. And I like Hangzhou. I like tourism. I like to travel across China. So I eventually wrote a book about Hangzhou, the Western Lake. So I think we don't have to look very far away in order to get the topics. Just take a step back and think about ourselves. What I am concerned about, what I am interested in, can all be the topics of our projects. So that's something I'm keeping doing until today. I'm still working on that, actually. So yeah, and finally, I would say sometimes if you are aware of my publication record, I published the 2 books in 2018. I published the 2 books this year because I work on 2 projects at the same time. Why? Because if you take a look at my 2 books in 2018. These 2 books were both about Republican China between 1911 and 1949, and they were linked to each other in many ways. They were both about communication and the media in China. So I can use the very similar sources, and I can have dialogues with this bunch of scholarship. And this year, I published 2 books about the People's Republic of China, Mao era China. In a similar fashion, I can use very similar sources. Of course, the topics are very different, but still, the framework could be quite similar to each other. But of course, sometimes it's a sheer luck to have 2 books published in the same year. I admit, but I usually do 2 projects in the same time, but I don't think I can do that in Hong Kong nowadays because of heavy administrative duty. It's hard to me to do so. Yeah, these are the ideas I have about how to publish stuff. But I had a lot of time in the United States. But not in Hong Kong. That's a big difference, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jason, for getting us started on the Q&A. And Qilang, very interesting thoughts about publication. I have to say, I think there's some credit due to perhaps your working style, because after I published my first book, I started working on 2 projects at the same time. And it took me forever to finish either. So it works for some, but maybe doesn't work for everybody. But we are getting comments and questions in the chat. Chuan Wimeng says, thank you for your talk and this amazing book, Professor He. I have a question on your choice to focus on these specific 5 directors. Were there any special reasons other than them being the most influential and prominent filmmakers? I'm also curious about if there were any directors who failed to work the system, and if you have addressed the failures in the book.
Yeah, very good question. I chose those 5 directors, yes, because of their famous, and I was able to get a lot of archival records about them. I admit, because of the materials, I would have to choose those 5 directors. But on the other hand, I would say they represented a whole spectrum of directors during the Mao era time. The first 2, Zheng Junli and Zhao Dan, were highly successful, and they became the favorite of the Communist Party, at the least in the first 17 years of the People's Republic of China. So the stories of those 2 directors were basically success stories. The 3rd and the 4th, Sun Yu and Wu Yonggang, were basically typical older generation directors who lost the favor from the Communist Party. I would say their films were not that successful. Okay. After 1949, essentially because, as I have said, Sun Yu's film was criticized quite harshly by the critics and the authorities. And Wu Yonggang's films were not allowed to be screened in mainland China. But they tried very hard to compromise with the system, to benefit from the system maximally, even though their efforts didn't really bear fruit. And the last director represented the younger generation directors who blossomed after 1949. So I would say I picked those five for different reasons: successful, less successful, and the young generation one. So I think they represented a full spectrum of directors at the time. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And I'm going to combine a question I had with Barbara Welke's question. And it struck me first when I was reading the book, and then when you did your introduction to the book, and you mentioned the vicissitudes, and that there were these shifts, even in this relatively short period of Mao era China, the sort of winds were going back and forth about what would be acceptable and what wouldn't. And for a non-specialist like me, it was very bewildering. And I wondered if it was clear to all these filmmakers, or if they also sometimes felt like, oh, I thought I was doing the right thing, and then now I'm being criticized. So taking your point that it was neither accommodation nor resistance, that they were, forming themselves in this context, but it was a context that was shifting, I think, a lot, it seemed to me. And so part of that, and Barbara Welke raises this question, is what impact the Cultural Revolution had on the Chinese film industry.
Okay, very good question. The Cultural Revolution. Speaking of the Cultural Revolution, probably we need to divide the 10 years into two periods somehow. In the first few years, it was the most radical part of the Cultural Revolution. All the directors were impacted in a negative way. There was no doubt about this. And most of the films, the vast majority of the films, were labeled as like counter-revolutionary. Or most of, virtually all those film directors were kind of punished in one way or another. Okay, and the first two directors I mentioned in my presentation became the party favorites in no small part because of their connections with the higher authorities, but their connections would become the burden, it would become the real problem in the end of the day. Let me say this. I don't want to spread some like political gossips, okay? But we need to understand that the first two directors or filmmakers actually had a very close connection with Jiangqing, Madame Mao. Back in the 1930s, Madame Mao and Zheng Junli and Zhao Dan were very close friends. And back in the 1950s, Madame Mao actually saved the first two directors from being the rightists in China. But their connections with Madame Mao would become the liabilities during the Cultural Revolution. So both of them were imprisoned in the end of the day. And Zheng Junli, the first one, died mysteriously as a result. So we cannot explain what happened, but everything we knew was the first one died, and the second one was imprisoned for many years until the end of the Cultural Revolution. And the second one, Zhao Dan, would die in 1980, not very long after the end of the Cultural Revolution. The third and the fourth directors became relatively unknown. They were also impacted by the Cultural Revolution, but we know very little about that. And Xie Jing, the last one, the younger generation director, actually, in the end of the day, in the second period of the Cultural Revolution, benefited from the decline of the Chinese film industry, because he was appointed as a director to make a revolutionary film at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. So I want to say, yes, the Cultural Revolution overall made a huge impact on the Chinese film industry, because basically the whole industry actually kind of came to a stop. But some younger generation was able to gain the opportunities. And in the 1980s, a new breed of directors came into being, including the famous ones like Zhang Yimou, okay, and they built up their arts based on the critique of the Cultural Revolution and something related to that. So yeah, there were ups and downs in the careers of those filmmakers, but the Cultural Revolution was definitely an extreme example of how low their fates could be in their career. Okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, we're running short on time for more questions, but before I close, I do want to let those of you who are here know that once we wrap up the formal part of the book club, you may stay on, and if Qilang and maybe Jason have a few minutes after the hour, you can maybe both just socialize, but also raise some additional questions since we're running out of time here. So I do want to thank both Qilang and Jason McGrath for a really terrific conversation about a very interesting and significant book. And to all of you who came on this summer evening to join us on Zoom. I'll say that the book club is going to go on vacation in August, but we will reconvene on Wednesday, September 20th, also at this 6 o'clock hour, to hear from Lowell Gudmundson, who did his PhD in 1982 and is a professor emeritus of Latin American Studies and History from Mount Holyoke College. And we'll have a little caffeinated conversation about his latest book, Costa Rica After Coffee, the Co-op Era in History and Memory, in conversation with history professor Patrick McNamara, who works on Central America. And so I thank you. Alex has put the link there if you want to go ahead and get registered for that September meeting. I think Alex can also put a link if you're so moved to make a donation to help support the history department. A lot of those donations go to fellowships for graduate students like Qilang was, and others are currently, and we'll be hearing about their books in future years in the book club. So with that, I will close out the official portion of the book club, but as I said, invite you, if you want to stay on for a few minutes extra after the hour, to informally say hello or raise a question that you didn't have a chance to pose during the hour. So thank you very much.